Welcome to Bible Mind, and we are glad you are here tonight, and we're going to get started with the next installment, if you will, of the history of the Christian church. For some time now, the church has really derailed a little bit. It's fallen off course, hasn't it? And the leadership of the church, they're starting to persecute people, which once the church was the persecuted, have become now the persecutors. Anybody that they deem as a heretic or anybody that teaches anything outside of the church. Can you imagine what the church would look like today if, let's just say, within our own church, somebody had a little bit different belief of one of our 16 fundamentals, and we literally took them out here in the softball field and burned them to death.
That's so awful.
That's what was going on. And so anybody that strayed in their belief system or tried to call into question something that was coming down from the popes or the cardinals during these times, it was met with harsh punishment. So the church has become increasingly political, has become the persecutor rather than the persecuted, and God had started raising up men like Peter Waldo, John Wycliffe, and John Huss that we talked about last week. By the way, I have something of a little... Lisa, y'all got this storage building, right?
No, I think it was his dad's.
Oh, your dad's. Okay. They just ran across this in their library. This is a Wycliffe Bible commentary, and so it's a little light reading, so I was going to peruse it. Oh, here's a card.
Money in there? I better take that back.
There might be a car key.
There might be a car key in here. That's
That
right.
red sports
So
car.
if you were here this morning, you know what that was about. But so I'm gonna read this week and see. And anyway, just thought that was cool that, a couple of weeks ago we talked about John Wycliffe and they ran across that. And so now the commentary wasn't written by John Wycliffe. It was a commentary on John Wycliffe by some other people. And so just to clarify that, but really cool. And so just wanted to show that to you. That God had raised these men up to start maybe setting a spark of reformation in the church and kind of stirring some things up, stirring the hearts of some men. The 1400s, which is where we are now, give us three things that become soil for the seeds of Reformation to grow. We're only talking about two of them tonight. Okay, so let's talk about Spain first. So if you remember, in 632, Muhammad establishes the new religion of Islam. And for the next 100 years, it spread quickly. It comes all the way up to Spain, and it starts spreading up above that. Or anybody remember what the Spanish Islamic people began to be called? The Moors, Mennonites. Good guess. No, the Moors, Moors. And so the Islam started spreading up through there, and so anybody remember who was able to stop Islam from spreading any further into Europe? I'll give you a clue. Charles Martel or Charles the Hammer. And so he comes down and he's able to stop them from spreading any further. And so they were pushed back just a little bit. And a Christian presence was established in the north of Spain, and they maintained a peaceful coexistence with the Islamic people by paying tribute. And so they basically, hey, we'll give you money if you'll leave us alone. And so that was the arrangement. It seemed to work for quite a while. For the next few hundred years, the Christian presence started growing southward, and they kept getting further and further down, and Islamic people were pushed just a little bit further south. And so this happened over a few hundred years. So at last, the Christian territory had expanded and pushed the Islamic people to just this area, the kingdom of Granada, okay? And so then this land of Spain was divided up into different kingdoms, if you will. So you had Aragon and Castile and Portugal, Navarre, and so it was all divided up like that. And each one of them had their own king or their own ruling family, if you will. So in the mid-1400s, there were two significant characters that were born in this area. Does anybody know who these guys are?
Ferdinand and Isabella.
Ferdinand and Isabella. Very good. So Isabella became Queen of Castile, and then Ferdinand was the king of Aragon. And the two got married actually in their teens, and they combined those two lands. Well, I'll go back to that. But these are like the two biggest areas. So once those two combined, that just kind of unified Spain altogether under one rule. And so they ruled all of Spain, more or less. And so because of their religious zeal, they became known as the Catholic monarchs. And they were, they're very zealous for the Lord, and we'll talk about a few of those things. But it didn't always go in the direction we would say, good Christian monarchs. So remember when we were talking about the Crusades in the early 1200s. Let's see where when we were in the 1200s, there was a group called the Cathars. You remember those? And so they had kind of rose up, and they wanted to be pure. They wanted to live a holy life, but there were a few teachings they had that was outside of what the Catholic Church taught. And we won't get into all that, but they were labeled as heretics, so much so that the Pope declared a crusade against them. And so they were hunted down, and their lands were taken and confiscated. It was called the Albigensian Crusade because there were a lot of Cathars in the area of the city of Albi, and so they started being called the Albigensians. The agents of the Pope slaughtered them. They took their lands and did, just all manner of horrible things. And this led to the establishment of what was called the Medieval Inquisition. So you've heard of the Inquisitions, right? And so the Medieval Inquisition, basically what the Inquisition was is their job was to go out and find heretics. And so they would do this by investigation and following clues and interviewing people, and then they find if they find a heretic, then they can do something about it, whatever that might happen to be. And so tribunals were set up regionally throughout Europe, and it met some resistance in Spain, especially in Castile. They kind of wanted to take care of their own affairs, and we don't need y'all coming in and messing up. And they said y'all, I'm pretty sure. We don't need y'all coming in and messing with us. We'll take care of our people, and if we find heretics, we'll take care of them ourselves. Just keep your inquisitions to yourself. And so that was kind of the arrangement. And so in Spain, you had a lot more tolerance of both Jews and Muslims, for example. And Jews and Muslims were generally allowed to follow their traditional customs in domestic matters as long as they didn't try to convert anyone. So as long as you're just minding your business, then we'll leave you alone. You do your thing, and it's okay. Now, during the reign of Henry III of Castile and Leon, this was in 1390 to 1406, the Jews faced increased persecution and were pressured to convert to Christianity by force. So it's basically, forced conversion, which really goes against, the Catholic Church does not condone forced baptisms. So, even then. But it kind of went on. It's like, okay, you convert or you die, but, you have to voluntarily convert. We're not going to make you convert, but if you don't convert, we'll kill you. I don't know. That's kind of a gray area there, whether it's a forced conversion or not. But so the Jews started seeing increased persecution, and were pressured to convert to Christianity. By 1391, the threat of violence hung over the Jewish community in Spain, and so they were faced with basically baptism or death is the choice that they were faced with. So, of course, there was an increase in what you would call nominal Christianity, right? And so the ones that converted to Christianity to preserve their life, they were called conversos, which is Spanish for converts. And so they were converted. So these conversos were the ones that came over to Christianity to keep from being killed. And so over time, they faced continued suspicion and prejudice, and a significant population of the Jews were converted outwardly, but they continued to practice their customs kind of secretly. So outwardly, they would do all the Christian things, but then they would keep their Jewish traditions kind of behind closed doors, but they kept doing those. Now, under Ferdinand and Isabella, these forced converts were denounced as a danger to the existence of Christian Spain. So in 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a bull authorizing the Catholic monarchs, namely Ferdinand and Isabella, to name inquisitors who would address this issue and root out these things. So what's the event that we're building up to right now? It has a name in history.
Spanish Inquisition.
What's that?
Spanish Inquisition.
You got it. You get a gold star. You get an extra piece of cake. So yeah, the Spanish Inquisition is what we're building up to right here. And so the Spanish Inquisition became brutal and harsh, and confessions were really born through torture. I mean, they would bring people in, and are you a true Christian or are you a heretic? Are you sure? And stretching them on the rag. I'm just making that up. I don't know what they did, but through torture, they would try to get confessions out of them, and a lot of them would confess, because they're being tortured, so they would confess, and okay, we knew it. Now we're going to burn you at the stake, And so, it was really a horrific time. The confessions that were won through torture, up to about 2,000 are said to have been burned at the stake. Ferdinand and Isabella issued an edict on March 31st, 1492, giving Spanish Jews the choice of either exile or baptism. And after that, 160,000 Jews were exiled from Spain. They had to leave their homes. They had to leave Spain just for being Jews. And so, it was just a really horrible time. In 1480, Granada stopped paying tribute. By this time, Granada was actually paying tribute because they were the lesser people now, and so they were paying tribute. Well, they just decided we're not going to do that anymore. So this prompted war. And so Ferdinand and Isabella, they launched war against Granada, and so it was a 12-year war. So during this 12-year war, the Moors were defeated, and Granada became part of Spain. So this turned suspicion on Muslims, and the Inquisition was aimed at them as well. So not only are they targeting Jews, but they're targeting Muslims. And again, thousands were killed, thousands were pushed out of Spain. Does anybody know what year? And this is just going to be off the top of your head unless you're just a real history buff, but do you know what year this war ended? We actually mentioned it probably a couple of months ago in another lesson.
In the 1400s.
What's that?
But it was definitely in the 1400s.
It was definitely in the 1400s.
1492.
1492, very good. So 1492 is when this war ended, and they finally conquered all of Spain, and the Muslims were pushed out, and all this Inquisition was actually the Inquisition went on for another couple of hundred years. So it was a prolonged period of time. But something else happened in 1492. Does anybody know what that was?
Columbus.
That guy right there. All right, so he come up with an idea. He said, I think we can go. Let me get my directions. I think we can go east by selling west. And so everybody thought he was crazy. And so he's been running around for 3 or 4 years trying to find a sponsor to sponsor him with some ships and crew and supplies or whatever, so he can go and find a path to the east, which was very lucrative in trade, by not going that way, by going west. And because he thought the world was smaller and round instead of flat. And everybody's like, you're crazy. You're just going to fall off the end of the earth. And he's like, I'll show you, And so he's been trying to find, he's even been to Spain a few times, and they were busy. They didn't have time to see him. They were fighting a war. And too busy, Inquisition and all that stuff going on. And so they didn't have time to see him. Well, now, 1492, the war's over. Got a little more time on their hands, and they say, okay, we'll hear your case. And so, as the rest, as they say, is history. Exactly. So now, it's important to know, too, that Isabella is, say what you want about the Inquisition, some of that stuff going on, but she really did have a heart to evangelize the world. She believed everybody needed to know about Jesus. And so she saw this as a venture not just about trade, but she thought it would be a good means by which to spread the gospel to the east. If we could establish an easier way to get to the east, then we can send missionaries and we can spread the gospel that way. Well, this struck a chord with Columbus because he too was of that mind. And if you read the diaries of Columbus, which are readily available for a limited time before they're all burned and hidden or something, but anyway, that's a different note. But you can read in there, if you read his diaries, peppered all through that, you see his heart and his desire for not just establishing trade, but to be part of this mechanism for finding a way to spread the gospel to the east. And so that was part of Columbus's desire and his interest as well. The family of Ferdinand and Isabella is significant really to later events. So we're going to talk just a little bit about their family because there's a few members of this family that is significant for the Reformation. So they had 5 children. The first was a daughter that they named Isabella, after her mom, I suppose. And she married Alfonso of Portugal. And then their second child, Joanna, was married to Philip, who was a prince of Habsburg. And so if you know, and I'm not going to get into all that, but if you know anything about Austria, the Habsburg family was like, really part of the ruling class, and they were part of the ruling of the Holy Roman Empire in Austria, that whole area for hundreds of years. And so they were a very important family. And so she married into the Habsburg family. And then they had a son who was Charles V. Charles V became emperor of the Holy Roman Empire from 1519 to 1556. Now this is significant because how many of you know where Martin Luther's from? Germany, right? Or then it was the Holy Roman Empire. Charles V was emperor during the time, and he was in opposition to Martin Luther. Okay, so that's why we wanted to kind of mention him and get him in the mix. So when we talk about Charles V later, you'll know that he's the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. The third child was John, and he married Margaret, also of the Habsburg family in Austria. And then their fourth child was Maria, which married Manuel I of Portugal. Catherine was the youngest, and she married Arthur of England. Now this was kind of a lot of marriages were arranged marriages for political purposes, for power structure, things like that. And so this was kind of an arranged marriage that happened. Now Catherine and Arthur were both, they were 15 years old when they married. So it was just an arrangement. It wasn't and this is important for later, but Arthur died 6 months after they were married, and they had never even consummated their marriage, and that's important because later we need to know that Catherine was a virgin when she married the next person, and that was Henry, which was Arthur's younger brother. Now, Arthur was the son of Henry VII, so that would make his younger brother Henry the VIII. Okay, so
she was Catherine of Aragon.
That's right. And so now you're kind of getting those pieces of the puzzle there. And so this is Catherine. She also is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and she marries Henry VIII. Let's talk about the 100 Years' War. We've mentioned it a few times because it's kind of come up in our context. But since the days of William the Conqueror of England, if you remember from the Norman invasion, William the Conqueror goes over and he conquers England from Normandy, which is France. And so he really, even though he left and went over there and ruled, they still kind of claimed France was theirs too. And so really there's been a power struggle for years and years and years over who controls France. England still thought, well, all of France is ours. Well, the French king says, well, no, it's not. It's ours. And so there's been this struggle back and forth, and it would erupt in war and then kind of back and forth for a number of years. So in 1337, the only region that the English had control over was Gascon, and war broke out for a number of reasons that we're not going to get bogged down into all that. But for about 30 years, England made headway in conquering more territory in France. So it looked like they were about to win France and take control over all of France. So then by the early 1400s, France began to prevail in pushing them nearly out. I mean, just to some coastal, I should have the map up there, but just to some coastal regions just along the edge. So France was just about to, take back over now. This is all during the 100-Year War. So in 1407, the King of France, his name was Charles VI, went crazy. And I mean literally psychotic breakdown, and he would have these episodes where he would just go nuts. Now, he was the king, so you still had to do what he said, but he would just randomly have people executed. One time he led a battle against his own people and slaughtered them. I mean, it was just like he was just nuts. And so he earned the name Charles the Mad. And so for good reason. So this made France kind of devolve into civil war because there were a lot of other nobles that said, hey, we need to do something about this. So this noble said, well, I think we'll take over and we'll be king. And this one wanted to be king. And so the France really devolved into civil war to see who would replace Charles VI or Charles the Mad. So in the middle of this civil war, the English took this as an opportunity to start gaining ground. And so they come in, they actually formed an alliance with Burgundy, which was under French rule, but they formed an alliance and really started conquering a lot of France. So with that in backdrop, in 1412, right in the middle of all this civil war, a girl was born to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romea. Was a peasant family in Domremy in northeast France, and her name was Joan. Joan of Arc, and no, she's not Noah's wife. I'm trying to tell you all that. I'm not tired of that joke yet, so just get over it. So Charles VI dies, and his 4 sons as heirs, they die as well. So now you have jockeying for who's going to be the king, and so this person finally prevails, and they would be who would be known as Charles VII. But the only problem with this is to be officially king and coronated king in France, it had to be done in Reims, France. The problem is Reims was now controlled by the English Burgundian alliance, so they couldn't even get there. So he couldn't become officially king until they could get to Reims. And so he was kind of maybe de facto king, if you will, but they couldn't really call him king just yet. At the age of 12, Joan had a vision. And in this vision, in which she never recanted, to her dying day, she would not go back on the fact that she saw what she saw, and she held fast to it, that she saw St. Michael, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine came to her in a vision, and they told her that she's to lead a French army and take the king to Reims to be coronated as king. And that's what they charged her to do. Say what you will about, whether you believe that or not, but she believed it. And for this story's purpose, that's all that matters. She truly believed that. Now, she's 12 years old. What do you do with that when you're 12 years old? You don't get your 12-year-old friends and let's go, And so, now, just to point this out, in this time, it wasn't uncommon for people to have visions and to see the saints and see things like this. And so, especially impressionable little girls. And so, she knew somehow that I probably won't be taken seriously. So she just kind of kept it inside for a long time. So by 1429, the English Burgundian alliance was, they were, just about to conquer all of France. And so they were held up at Orleans, which is right there. And the prevailing thought was, if Orleans falls, all of France falls. And so this is kind of where the stalemate was. And a lot was hinging on this what happens right here. And so Joan, now 17, she goes to see the king, but they wouldn't let her in to see him. It's like, 17-year-old girl, get out of here. We got important business or whatever. And she just kept coming back and pleading her case. And they were so impressed with her that eventually they just said, you know what, okay, we'll give you audience with the king. So they brought her in and brought her before the king, or the king-to-be, Charles, and who was actually about her age, so they were about the same age. But she pleads her case, she tells about the vision, and she says all of this, and she makes such a good case that they thought, what could it hurt? We'll give her a small army and, just be done with it. So they give her a small army, and she goes toward Orleans, but as she goes, there's several battles along the way. So every battle she gets into, she wins. Every one of these battles. So with every victory, more people start to come around her. They're like, hey, something's going on here. Remember, Tommy was talking about it this morning. You have one person that, when that one person makes a stand, they may get criticized at first, but as they go, people will start rallying. This was what was happening to Joan. As they were winning these little victories, people started coming together. I mean, the battles were intense. Joan was always, like, when they would go into battle, 17-year-old girl, okay? I mean, keep this in mind. She was one of the first ones out front leading the charge, and she was wounded several times. One time she took an arrow through the neck. Obviously not, a fatal wound or anything, but I mean, she pulls it out and gets up and, she's ready to go again. And I mean, people were just impressed. They were just like fired up. If this girl can take it, let's go, And so, I mean, this just fired them up. So they went to Orleans. By the time they got to Orleans, they had a huge army, and it was a decisive victory for France. They drove the English back and Burgundians back away from Orleans and won the battle that day. And so everybody was just really impressed. Joan, she obviously never been to military school or anything like that, but some of her military tactics were so impressive that nothing had ever been done like that before. It's almost like she had just some kind of natural ability to, devise military tactics. And so she really changed the course of the military. I keep using the word tactics, but the military methods for years to come from what she did. They emulated the things that she did. Okay, so now they've captured Orleans, right? They've driven back the English and French from Orleans, and they've saved that area. But that's not the goal, is it? What's the goal? Reims. We got to get the king to Reims. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't. Let me just go back to that map right here. I'll show you. Okay, so Reims is up here. So they've conquered this, but they still have to get way up here. And so they continue fighting, and they carved a path actually all the way to Reims like that. And so they kind of split the other forces, but they cleared a path all the way to Reims. They got the king there, they got him coronated and everything, just as the goal was. And so that's the story of Joan of Arc. Now that's not the end of Joan of Arc. She was actually captured in a subsequent battle. She was captured by the Burgundians. And you would think that newly coronated King Charles VII, who owed everything to Joan, would mount a rescue attempt, right? Or at least some kind of negotiations. Hey, let's work something out here and get Joan back. He did nothing. It's just like, oh well, so much for her, hope it works out for her.
Because she was just a little girl.
I guess so. And so they didn't do anything to try to get her. And so the Burgundians sold her to the English. And so the English took her and they put her on trial as a heretic. And so what grounds, I don't really know. And so the trial started. And we got to get back to that. The trial started and the cardinals interrogated her. The audience was just amazed at her brilliance. Keep in mind, she's about 19 at this point. And as they interrogated her, trying to trip her up and get her to say something that would be some type of offense that would be worthy of death, they couldn't trap her. Just one little example that I found, one of the questions that was asked was, do you know you are in God's grace? Now that doesn't sound very tricky, but if you put it in the context of that time, in that time, if she would have said no, then that would have meant everything she did was outside of God's grace, right? And so that would have been worthy of death. But if she would have said yes, the belief at that time was that you never really know if you're in God's grace. So if she would have said yes, she would have been going against what the church taught. Then she would have been a heretic. And so either way she was could have been called down on. So here's what she answered. And by the way, this the what do you call it of the court? The transcript of the court. The stenographer. The court conversation is recorded by a stenographer, and so this is actually quotes from the trial. So this is the question that was asked. Joan responded, "If I'm not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." And the stenographer put a little footnote on that, saying that the cardinals were stupefied. They're just like, I don't know what to do with this girl. And so this is kind of how the trial went. And so they wound up trying her or convicting her as a heretic anyway, based on the fact that she wore men's clothing. And so that was enough to take her out on, let's see, I have the date here somewhere, May 30th, 1431, at 19 years old, and burned her at the stake. They were so concerned that people would use her relics, or her body as relics, that they burned her 3 times and scattered her into the river, because they didn't want anybody to have any kind of cause to, like save a piece or whatever, because relics were a big thing, especially in the Catholic Church. And so, fast forward just a little bit, the French army kept using Joan's battle tactics, actually, and 22 years later, they won the 100-Year War using Joan's battle strategies, this 17 to 19-year-old girl that had come up with ways to win the war. And so that's Joan of Arc. If you didn't know Joan of Arc beforehand, now you do. In 1456, this is the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, Joan's condemnation was reversed by the Catholic Church, and the prosecutor was actually condemned as a heretic. Except he was already dead, so they didn't get to do anything to him. But, at least in retrospect, they said, okay, we got it wrong. It's kind of like the replay officials in the NFL. It's like, we got that scoring play wrong, so we're going to reverse it. Even though the outcome of the game was still the same. But we reversed our call. So,
Did they consider her a saint?
In 1920, they venerated her as a saint. So, significantly later.
Before that had the halo.
Right. So, in 1920, she, was declared a saint, and so now she's Saint Joan of Arc, I guess. I guess it would be officially Joan d'Arc, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's have a little bit of discussion. Have you heard the voice of God?
Yes.
Joan claimed to have been visited by 3 saints. And so just in way of discussion, what do you think about that? I know typically we don't believe, we've already talked about this in one of our other lessons, but, we don't believe that those that have gone on can come back and visit us, right? She claims even in her dying or her trial or whatever, she at pain of death refused to recant the vision that she had. It could be that, if she did have, that God was speaking to her, she would have envisioned these saints that she revered. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So that could have been the personality that she put on them. Just thoughts. Any other thoughts? In Christian circles, you hear a lot, and we even speak this way a lot of times. God told me this, and God told me that, and you hear, we say that a lot, don't we? But I cautiously say that I think we may say that too much. And the reason I'm saying that is, we want to be led by the Spirit, and we want for our steps to be ordered by God. And that's very important for us. But when we say, God told me this, we have to make sure that that's what God told us, right? And not, this is the way I feel, so therefore it sounds more important for me to say, God told me that. Does that make sense? For example, somebody told me one time that, I was trying to talk to them about coming to church, and they said, well, God told me not to go to church. And so my thought was, no, he didn't. So you see what I'm saying? Because for whatever reason, they felt a need to be separated from church for whatever reason. So to them, God told them that because that's what they felt. You see where I'm going with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we have to be careful that we don't project God's voice on the things that we feel. You see what I'm saying? Because, when we're emotional people, and we can feel something really strongly. And that's where discernment comes in. We have to discern what's God's voice and what's last night's taco. We have to discern feeling from actual God's voice. And not just project God's voice upon the things that we want to validate. I'm going to tell you about a tale of 2 cities. I think I have one up here. Okay. Mahanaim. You remember the story when Jacob was leaving home and he went to this place and he laid down, he put his head on a pillow, and then all of a sudden something happened. What happened?
He saw the ladder. Angels.
Right. Okay. So he saw the vision of the ladder, and the angels were ascending and descending, and they were coming up and down. And so that was the moment that God spoke to him. He had been raised by a godly dad, had some issues with his brother, was known as the deceiver. His name Jacob even meant deceiver. And he was a little bit of a trickster and got in a little bit of trouble because he tricked his brother out of the birthright, and now he's, hey, I got to go somewhere else. And so he goes to this place, and all of a sudden, for the first time to him, God speaks to him. And he hears God's voice, and he names this place Mahanaim, which means...
House of bread.
No, that's Bethel. It means God's camp. It literally, it means two camps. Okay, so what he was saying is, he's seeing this ladder opened up and the angels coming down. He's like, here's my camp and there's God's camp. So this one place, there's two camps right here. And so that's what Mahanaim means, is two camps. And so that place, Mahanaim, became known as the place where you can hear the voice of God. And all through Israel, when they were there, even after they came back from Egypt and settled in the Promised Land, this place where Jacob had this vision was significant to them because it was a place that Jacob heard the voice of God. And I remember the first time that I can say that I heard God's voice. And I was raised in a Christian home, and obviously there's other ways to hear God's voice. I gave my heart to the Lord when I was 5 years old, so you can say, no one comes to the Father except for what? The Father draws him. And so technically when you get saved, it's a response to hearing the Father's voice. But that aside, when I was 9 years old, I was at a camp in South Texas, and a friend of mine, his name was Chad Morgan, he was there, and of course he had two sisters at home, twin sisters, Zandra and Judith, and so they were home, but me and him was at this camp, and we were around the altars praying this time, and there's sometimes you don't remember a lot about your childhood, but this is like a vivid memory that I have, and so we were praying. He comes to me, he's just panicked. He said, I saw a vision. I saw that my mom and my sisters were in a wreck, and I don't know if they're dead. I don't know if they're okay. I don't know what's going on. And, he was just in a panic. And so I said, well, let's pray. 9-year-old kids, okay? And so I said, let's pray. And so we're in the altar, and we're praying, and God told me, he said, go outside and look up. So I said, okay, I don't remember much about the arrangement. I don't remember a counselor saying, hey, don't go out that door or anything like that. But I went outside and I looked up, and God said, if you see 3 stars in a triangle, that's confirmation that they're okay. Now, my adult self says, you can look up in the sky and see 3 stars in a triangle any given time, right? That's my adult mind. So I realized that. But my 9-year-old mind, I was looking for 3 specific stars, right? And I look up and I see 3 stars in a triangle, and I knew everything was going to be okay. So I go back in and I tell Chad this, and I said, God said this and this and this, and they're going to be okay. Now, as it turned out, there hadn't been a wreck. They were okay. And now my adult mind, I look back at that and I said, that was the devil trying to rob him of whatever God was trying to do for him in the altar, and trying to disrupt him in that time by distracting him with this other. And so God stepped in to make sure that he knew that things were okay. And so anyway, just saying that those moments are specific or significant when God speaks to us, and we know that when his voice comes in, it can have a changing effect. We'll see. Previously, he knew his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham heard and talked with God, but now he has communication that was initiated by God himself. So God had singled him out to talk to him at this one location. So this became a sacred place in Israel. So let's fast forward now. So some years later, Israel finds itself in Egypt in slavery. 400 years later, 430, Moses leads them out. They go into the promised land. Joshua helps them conquer the land. They go through the period of the judges. Then they want a king. They get Saul. Saul and Jonathan, conquer a lot of stuff or whatever. Then Saul kind of goes mad, right? And Saul and Jonathan are both killed. David becomes king. So David, he conquers all his enemies. And then Jonathan, his close friend, right? He starts wondering, I wonder if there's anybody in the house of Saul that I can be kind to. Now, what's the typical thing to do when you become king in any of these periods of time?
They'd wipe out their enemies.
Wipe out any heirs from the, right? And so, that's the common thing to do. And so, because of this, when it was found out that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle, the nursemaid of Jonathan's son picks his son Mephibosheth up and starts running out with him and falls down and crushes his feet, kind of like I did Milo's this afternoon.
Oh, no.
And she was trying to love K-Paw, and she was trying to hold on to my legs when I was walking, and I wound up stepping on her feet, and now she don't like me. But she's not crippled in her feet like Mephibosheth was. And so Mephibosheth, they get out of town and they go into hiding. And David, years later, he says, okay, is there anyone left from the house of Saul that I can be kind to? And so somebody said, I think I know where a kid is. Now Mephibosheth is an adult now. And so they seek out Mephibosheth. He's crippled, but they bring him to David's house, and David takes care of him for the rest of his life. Does anybody know where Mephibosheth was living?
It had an interesting name like Lodabar.
You get an extra piece of cake too. Lodabar. Does anybody know what Lodabar means? It means no word. No word. And so you have Mephibosheth, who was once in line to be king, has now been living in Lodabar, living in no word, grew up there, lived there all of his life, no word. Do you know where no word is? Where Lodabar is? It's 10 miles from Mahanaim.
Wow.
He was living in no word, next door to God's camp, to the two camps. And when I think about that, and how many times that, we feel like, and maybe you haven't been in this place, but have you ever been in a time of your life where you just feel like you can't hear God speak? That you've been forgotten, that, I don't know what I did to make God mad, but he's not talking to me anymore, and all these things are going wrong, and I don't know what to do, and I need God's guidance, but I'm not hearing his voice, and you're in Lodabar. But it's significant for us to know that anytime you're in Lodabar, you're next door to Mahanaim. God's never very far off, and he's always waiting just to make connection with you.